Welcome to ecotopiaumedia. I am your host, Melissa McGinnis, joined by my co-host, Tom Wright. We also have another lovely guest, Brenda Platt, joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. Hi, Brenda. Nice to see you.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
So you're the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. That's interesting.
What brought you to here? Where was Brenda where she was young?
Well, I've actually been at the Institute almost 30 years. I joined 2 weeks out of college.
Okay.
So I know I'm dating myself, but where it began was probably when I was 9 years old, waiting in gas lines to get, with my family, to get gas in our car because of the oil crisis. And my dad saying to me, we need people to be working on alternative sources of energy than, fossil fuels. And I remember at 9 saying, okay, I'm going to focus on solar energy, which, I didn't end up doing, but I do have a degree in mechanical engineering and focused on energy conservation, and there's no better way to focus on energy conservation than resource conservation and waste reduction, reuse, recycling, and composting, which is what I'm focusing on these days. So it was, people sometimes say, oh, you're an engineer. No, I'm not an engineer. I have a degree in engineering, but I practice the work. So I don't consider myself an engineer. Although when I first got out of school, I did work for a compost facility, designing the motors for the conveyors to transport compost. So I sized them. It was my only engineering experience ever.
So were there, between 9 and 22, were there any sort of interesting projects, interesting people, certain books that influenced you?
Yeah, I would say that the probably seminal impact on my life was the fact that I lived outside of the United States growing up. I was very fortunate to have grown up in West Africa, the Caribbean. I lived in Iran for a couple of years. Even lived in England for a year, but Trinidad and Tobago when I was a teenager, and in West Africa was Liberia. So I grew up feeling like I was a citizen of the world, and not, kind of this jingoistic, American patriotic citizen. So, and that, seeing poverty and the difference between rich and poor and the difference between having resources and not having resources really impacted what I wanted to do. As a young kid, when I was living in Liberia, we had a lot of Peace Corps volunteers coming through our house on weekends and holidays, for Thanksgiving and whatnot. And they were, of course, young in their 20s, but to me, they were older and so cool working on appropriate technology. So that was also an influence, seeing other people coming to these, impoverished countries and working for a better life there. And so I always thought I would work abroad in appropriate technology. So E.F. Schumacher, Small is Beautiful was a big influence. Lewis Mumford on the techniques of, civilization was a big influence on me. Some of those books you asked. And so, but in the end, I met Neil Seldman. I think I just graduated from school, and I knew I wasn't going to go interview with General Electric or any of the big, engineering companies like a lot of my classmates. And a friend of mine was working for the Institute. He was doing pollution prevention, toxics prevention. And he said to me, oh, Brenda, why don't you come work for me for the summer? You can do some research and filing for me. I'll pay you $5 an hour, which is what he offered me. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. And I think Neil Seldman, one of the co-founders who I've worked with for 30 years now, decided that my friend Larry didn't need an assistant, that he needed one. So I met with him, and he offered me a job, which I accepted the next day, and I've been here ever since. And when I first joined the Institute, I would say a good part of the first decade was spent fighting trash incinerators all around the country, a lot of which were in California and LA.
Yeah, we're here in Long Beach, and there is one here.
There is one. So that was one that got built. I'm so sorry we failed on that, Tom.
So where'd you matriculate from?
George Washington University.
Okay, so that's what. Okay, I was trying to figure out what brought you to the D.C. area.
Yeah.
Okay, that's Now, how did you choose that university? Given all your worldly travel?
Well, my mom was here, so I picked it as a school to apply to, and I was waitlisted at Cornell, but I didn't, and they told me I could get in January, but once you go to another school, I think as, a freshman, it's pretty hard to switch.
Yeah.
So I ended up at GW, and I'm glad I did, because, I don't think I would be here doing what I'm doing if I hadn't, ended up in DC.
Yeah, who knows? You'd be running restaurants if you went to Cornell,
Yeah.
Or a hotel. Aren't they famous for hotel and restaurants?
Hotel management.
Yeah.
But they have a good engineering.
Yeah, no, I know they do. I know it's a great school, actually. So I'm not trying to beleaguer it. Okay, so that's fascinating. So you were in anti-incineration movement 30 years ago.
That's right. And even before I got the job at the Institute, when I was in school, I worked for a renewable energy company, and I did a lot of work on wind energy and solar with them, capacity, and I did a report for Bolivia on what what renewable energy technologies would be good for Bolivia, and I found out that Bolivia had a homegrown Mennonite community that was building kind of homegrown windmills, and the Altiplano region up there on the plateau, a lot of wind resources. But I found out through the consulting company that was not what they wanted me to recommend, because the idea was to open up markets in these developing countries for American renewable energy companies to sell their technologies down there. It wasn't about creating a homegrown technology that was built from the grassroots up. It was about creating markets. And I remember being very disillusioned with that contracting company. And so when I met Neil, and even though the work was in the US and not abroad, he said, you know what, Brenda, we can't change the rest of the world if we can't change American cities. And that spoke to me. So I've been working here ever since, doing just that.
Fascinating. Well, I think that your childhood really, it seems like a lot of, and I don't know if this is a word or not, environmentalists that we've interviewed in the past have had like this dichotomy of a childhood of being in wealthy cities and also in impoverished cities. It's fascinating that you also came from that experience. So, well, thank you for sharing that with us, Brenda. We're going to wrap this session up with you and come back and speak a little bit more about your work with the Institute.
Okay.
Thank you.